Okay, hello everybody, welcome. It's James Dearsley here from the What Does the Data Tell You show. I'm the founder of the Digital Marketing Bureau, and I'm sorry we started a little bit late today, and so you have to excuse me on that. But look, what does the Data Tell You show? So I set this show up quite a while ago now, simply because in my big belief in the very nature of this term, data analytics and social analytics, and the fact that I feel that a lot of brands are now familiar with this whole world of social media, but sometimes they still are a little bit frightened about understanding the data that they can now get. In my sort of early days, it was very qualitative, and you had to go into the sort of the financial director's office and the MD and say, this is what I've done, and it used to be a bit fluffy. But nowadays, what you can do is obviously you can analyze around it, and one of the most famous quotes that I always use is from the management consultant, I think it was an Austrian-American, Peter Drucker, who said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's one of my biggest beliefs, and hence why we're doing this show, to make it very simple in terms of what data means to you. And I'm really pleased to have the guys on here from Chartbeat today. I've got Doug and David coming on. I won't do them the disservice of trying to explain what Chartbeat is. It's a big animal. But in fact, I tell you what, without further ado, let me just bring in, I don't know who's going to speak first, or Doug or David, but why don't you introduce yourselves, guys, and then talk a little bit about sort of what Chartbeat is, what it does, and how powerful it is.
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is David van Dokkum. I'm a product manager at Chartbeat.
Doug Benedicto, also product manager at Chartbeat.
Product managers, wow, we're lucky. We're lucky.
Chartbeat's been around for about 5 years, and our kind of core focus for a long time was doing real-time data analytics, right? And what that means is that we kind of had a very sophisticated technology, and we're able to track, with a delay of maybe a second or two, the point at which someone loaded a page, and then show that in a real-time streaming dashboard. That technology has only grown, as has the amount of people who are using it. And so at this point, we have about 80% of the top U.S. publishers, online publishers, using Chartbeat's editorial platform. We're in about, I think it's 61 countries?
Sure, that sounds right.
Something like that.
That sounds all right. That sounds good. If I could travel to 61 countries, I'd be very happy, let alone work in 61.
Yeah, they send us to all of them. But yeah, so basically newsrooms all over the world are using Chartbeat's editorial product in order to understand how people are consuming their content, how much time they're spending reading it, how they're getting to their site, and so through that, at any given time, we're measuring, somewhere around 11 to 12 million what we call concurrents, or people who are currently on any of the sites in our network. And we just have this incredibly vast amount of data for all of those sessions that we track, which allows us to get some pretty powerful insights into how people just use the internet in general. So that's kind of what we're doing. The other side of Chartbeat is basically thinking about how we can understand how people consume content, and how we can help publishers monetize their content a little bit better through kind of newer business models, new ways of thinking about value online. But we'll certainly talk about that bit a little bit later now.
So that's an awful lot of data from an awful lot of countries. And what I'm quite interested there, just as a sort of start out, is you mentioned about the real-time analytics and how publishers are using that. I don't know if you can. I'm aware, obviously, you have client confidentiality and everything. I don't know if you've got any ways of mentioning any names that you're working with and how they are potentially using these sorts of tools. Can you give us any more information on that? Is that allowed?
Sure. Some examples of sites that use us are, for example, the Gawker Network or Gannett, ESPN. Really, it really varies. We have a lot of large publishing sites, a lot of large networks of news, as well as we also offer a basic product, and so we have a mom and pop websites across the world as well. Now, with the publishing sites, one of the biggest use cases that people have there is making decisions throughout the day of what kind of content they're going to be focusing on during that day at that moment. For example, one use case is looking at the homepage and looking at what stories you're actually heavily promoting on that homepage. Because back in the old school days, when for example, in the days of print newspapers, you only had your editorial judgment. These are the important stories for the day. This is what we're focusing on. This is our headline spot. These are the surrounding stories. Everything else is going on subsequent pages. However, part of what that was born out of wasn't just journalistic integrity, which is still really important. The publishers are actually deciding this is important news that people have to read. But part of that was actually a lack of data and a lack of immediate feedback, because as people were subscribing to newspapers, you don't know what people are actually interested in reading, what they're really focusing on. And so when you get that real-time feedback, you can actually adjust your expectations because, for example, as a certain type of publisher, you might decide that, we want more traffic today, we're trying to drive more people into our site, we need to focus on reality show X or Y. Whereas that might not actually pan out. And I mentioned that example explicitly because when we focus on real-time data from your users and what they're interested in reading, one of the dangers, and completely understandable, is people thinking that this signals that, okay, we're going to put up cat slideshows or that sort of thing. We're going to focus only on listicles and that kind of content, which might not actually necessarily be what your audience is interested in reading.
Okay, so just to bring that back a little bit, just so I'm understanding that correctly, and obviously everybody who's watching it is, I mean, what you're doing is you're giving a real-time feedback mechanism for publishers of content to say this is working and this is not working. And as a result of that, what these publishers are able to do is then reorientate what their, let's say their homepage in this instance is doing, to build that homepage in a way that it matches their definitions and goals for that particular day.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. Okay, I understand. I get it. That's really good.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, another kind of key element about this is not just the fact that you're getting this feedback in real time, but also it's important to think about what metrics you're actually using to, to make changes on the site, right? So Chartbeat actually doesn't measure page views at all. We look at concurrence, so how many people are on a page, and we look at what we call engaged time, which is the amount of time that people are spending actually consuming content. And we like those metrics because page views are essentially just measuring the efficacy of a headline, right, or a link, right? As soon as someone clicks, it's done, and you don't really have any qualitative metrics. Whereas using time actually gives you a way to measure the efficacy of the content itself. If you see an article that has an average engaged time of 5 seconds, then you know that people are clicking on it and then leaving immediately because they're not spending any time actually reading that. So while you might have something that's great for juicing page views, you don't really have something in that case that's actually keeping your audience on your site.
Absolutely.
And I do want to just to clarify one thing there. When David mentioned that we're paying attention to engaged time or consumption time or reading time, all synonymous terms in this case, we actually are measuring how long people are reading, as opposed to metrics that you might be familiar with, like dwell time or time on page or time on site, which usually just incorporates how long you leave the tab open, and you can, and also generally only measures if you go from one page to another. But we're actively checking in: are you scrolling? Are you in this tab right now? And so on.
And I suppose, to be honest, I mean, let's just get the crude bit. And actually, I want to pick up on one point before I go on to that one that I really particularly like about this, which is, for me, it's about the democratization, if that is even a word, of content. Because, let's go back, and I don't know why it's popping into my head about the old newsroom of Superman, right? And Clark Kent used to go in with his copy and say, this is what I want featured in the Daily, whatever it was, Daily Planet, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And the screaming news editor would say, it's a load of rubbish and I'm not putting it in. And that was all opinion-based. And now what we're talking about here is that we're able to say, look, do you know what? I think this will work. And you're able then in real time to say, actually, it is working. We need more of that sort of stuff. Or it isn't working. We're going to move it around and see if it gets better looks, better views, whatever it is, wherever it may be on the page. It's almost like taking Google cost per click advertising and having a live feed of whether your first, second, third, fourth, fifth, down all the way down to 10th place is actually causing more click-throughs and more sort of conversions. I mean, it's a fantastic tool to democratize the very nature of content.
Yeah, and actually, I like that term. And one of the things that it kind of speaks to is that on the web, one thing that's really unique and is one of the biggest challenges for people who host content on the web and who rely on their viewership for income, they need people to come in so they can drive up their advertising revenue or whatever else have you, is that there is so much content that's available on the web now, and it's all available for free, that realistically you're not existing in a bubble anymore in the way that you could in the past when you had your hometown newspaper and you had and maybe you had the New York Times if you had, if you were in the U.S. and you needed a national news outlet, and similar for TV and such. Now you have hundreds, thousands of websites that you could go to at any given time, and so being able to focus on what your readers actually want to read and what they come to you specifically to read is even more important.
Absolutely, and I know we're probably going to mention this a little bit later on, but it always comes back to the quote that I often like using in these sorts of times, which is there is now a big move in this whole content marketing arena that we are in, that it's not so much the return on the return on investment, it's about the return on engagement, and they're almost sort of one of the same. And one of the things that I particularly like about what you've just said there is that this very nature of suddenly being able to understand that return on engagement means that from an advertising perspective, you've got a great opportunity here as well. Because what you're starting to do here is you're starting to say, look, as a site, we are able to work out what is working and what is not working. So something here like a Chartbeat system, or platform, I should rather say, is enabling a website to understand an awful lot more about what is working and what is not working. But secondly, what I particularly like about this is suddenly you're able to monetize your content in a far, far, far better way, which is you're able to say to advertisers with absolute confidence, we know this works better than that, because actually, and like you said, it's not about dwell time, but people are staying this long on here and that long on here, therefore, where do you want your advert to be? We can almost sort of trade on the prices of advertising based on the amount of time people are spending on different posts and where they're posting.
Yeah.
Ah, that's cool. I like that.
And actually, just a cool data point that I want to share that connects to that. Basically, as we talk about engagement and such, one unfortunate thing about the term engagement that we use is that can be used in so many different ways by so many different people. For example, when people talk about engagement on social media, they tend to refer to how many links are actually being shared, how many people are actually sharing links to this story. That is our proxy for engagement on social media. But this is, let's see.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've sort of completely abandoned our game plan here.
No, that's great. I like that it's flowing easily. So this is a kind of interesting data point here, which is basically showing for articles with high social activity, articles that are getting linked more heavily than others, as you can see up here, there's effectively no correlation that we've seen between how often a story is being shared and how long it's actually being read for.
Okay, so let's just take this back one step, if you don't mind, Doug.
Sure.
So this is a piece of analytics that people can get from the Chartbeat platform. I presume. I'm absolutely presuming here, so forgive me if I'm wrong. And what you're looking at here is you're looking at read time along the bottom against social activity along the y-axis. Christ, I'm going back to my my mathematics days. And so just interpret this graph for me here for a second. So.
Sure. So what we're seeing right here is, so on the y-axis, absolutely, as you said, this is social activity. So this is how frequently people are sharing links to articles. And this isn't directly, this graph that we have here isn't directly in our products, but this is something that our data science team did based on the data that we do have in our products and across our websites that we're measuring. So what we're looking at here is as you go higher up, those are articles that got shared more and more. I think the data source for this was specifically Twitter. And on the x-axis here, as you go further to the right, that's showing articles that had a longer time spent reading them in total by all users. So what you can see is as you're going up here, if more shares meant more total time spent reading a given article, you'd expect a line, like a thick line, going straight up and to the right. Whereas we're not seeing that at all. Basically, high read time, there's no guarantee that that's actually being highly shared as well. You can see that there's a complete blank spot in the top right which you'd expect if that were the case.
What a fascinating graph. So just define for me, I don't know if there's any metrics on what is classified as a low read time and a high read time. Is that minutes? Is that in seconds? Have you got any idea on that? And the only reason I say that, and I'll give you time to think that through, is because from a social perspective in terms of writing content, you now realize that from an SEO perspective, the best blog posts are between, I think it was 600 and 800 words. That is what Google is looking at and saying that is not thin content, which has obviously just been wheedled out by this whole Pandler update, which has just come in. This is good content-rich content, which is between 600 and 800 words. So from that, is there any bearing on what you just said there about this low read time and high read time? Is there a numerical value to that out of interest? Because taking that on a step further, I suppose that depends a lot on whether we're talking about text that people are reading or whether that is about video that people are reading. You don't read a video.
Watching, yeah.
You watch a video, but so that's an interesting sort of insight there. I think that's so.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So unfortunately, I don't remember exactly the cutoff that we're using in terms of low and high. But certainly, yeah, I mean, the type of content kind of has a huge impact on how much time people are actually spending with it. Yeah.
It's also what that graph is showing. It's showing that classical bell curve that you sometimes get with the length of content in terms of whether people actually are bothering to read it, are bothering to share it, and that is astounding for me. Which is it saying that you don't want too longer posts. If you're going to get longer posts, you're not necessarily. You put all this time and energy into these massive 2,000, 3,000 word posts because people think it's a great engagement tool. What you've just sort of suggested then is perhaps it's not. You want in the middle-y sort of length.
Right, exactly. So yeah, we've definitely looked at some data also that basically looks at length of an article, basically which we measure through pixels. How many pixels down does this article go? And as articles get a bit longer, we do see higher amounts of reading time spent on those, which makes sense. Basically, if you have a 2-sentence article, just like a really quick post, no one can really spend much time reading that. As it goes longer, we do see increased amount of time actually spent reading those pieces, but there are diminishing returns to that. After a certain point, we don't see much incremental benefit measured in time to the length of that article. I mean, certainly there are people who will read long-form articles, that go on for thousands and thousands of words for longer amounts of time. But on the whole, on average, we don't see an increase after a certain number of pixels.
And actually, would you mind just defining that for me about this whole issue of pixels? Because, and for those of you at home who are just tuning in, we're here with Chartbeat just sort of talking about the use of analytics, and especially real-time analytics and how they're using it. But most importantly, for those of you who are watching a record version of this, we're using the Showcase app, which if you're clicking on this in the recorded version, you'll see a little be a part of the conversation button on the bottom left or right-hand side of this. When you click on that, you'll see all the articles I'm referencing here, including Chartbeat's Google Plus platform, or profile, sorry, and their actual website address as well. I'm just going to load up a very interesting article which talks about exactly that, which is this issue around pixels and the length of posters, not as in words, but as in the amount of pixels that are used. Could you just clarify that for those of us who are perhaps not familiar with this classification?
Yeah, sure. So, and it's mostly because Chartbeat, at least at the moment, isn't actually kind of reading the content on the page. That's something we're starting to explore. So when we are kind of we're just looking at kind of raw numbers when we're kind of going through these studies, right? So we're using pixel length as a way to get a sense for basically how large the page is and how much content is there. So we typically see things to running between 3,000 and 4,000 pixels, and or actually most pages. If you pull up that article, you can kind of see this kind of green line showing things between 4,000 and 5,000. So while we can't talk specifically about the amount of content that's written, we use pixels as a proxy essentially to get at the same idea, which is basically the length of the page.
And just as I suppose a a clarification on that. When you're classifying pixels, I presume it's pixels as in the visual sense. So is that picking up pixels in pictures, for example?
Yeah, so basically what we're looking at is, when you have a web page, you might have an image at the top, you have a body of text that represents the article, and so on, and you have everything that's surrounding it, which basically leads to you having a window size or a page size of however large. So for example, in this Google Hangout, I can see the view of you right now, I can see everything that's on the right-hand side, and basically the total height of the page, the total height of the window plus all the amount of scrolling that I can do in the window constitutes the page's pixel height.
Okay, all right. So
it's analogous to like if you think of a printed page and you think about how many inches long is that page.
Yeah, so the classical publishers sort of thing, yeah. So, okay, well, look, what I'm ever so conscious of, as I often do, I've gone off on a complete and utter tangent from where we're going to be talking. But, for me, what you guys are doing here with the real-time analytics, especially in the publishing world, and how people can work that, I think is particularly interesting. But, look, I know you've got an awful lot of sort of data statistics that we can have a little sort of churn through about, and am I right in saying it's mainly about how people are using the web? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of what we're doing on all sides.
Okay, so what have you got? Come on, let's boil into some.
All right, let's jump into just a few other points of data that I think are kind of fascinating. So on the idea of
when I was younger, if I knew that I would be having live streamed events around the world on the internet talking about graphs, I think my maths teacher would be so proud.
Well, here's one that's not actually a graph. But this kind of relates to the same principle. I think you can see this here, right, where it says most reads per click and least reads per click.
Yeah, got it. Perfect.
This is obviously you can tell by some of the words here that this was done a year ago. But this connects to that same idea of what is the best success metric when we're looking at content on the web, and it basically we're looking at in a time period of about a month last summer, what were the most clicked on stories across the web, and out of those, which were actually the most read. So we noticed a major dichotomy in the words that were in the titles of these articles. So you can see over here on the left-hand side, most reads per click were articles that in the titles had words like Obama, Obamacare, Zimmerman, Egypt, Syria, and so on. Whereas least reads per click, top, best, colleges, companies, etc. Basically, what we can see here is that the articles that were getting the most reads were things about heavier topics, in a lot of cases, political, social issues. Whereas the least reads per click were basically what indicate listicles, slideshows, things like that. Basically, pieces of content which go out largely to game the page view system, the page view and CPM system, getting people to click on this slide, but then on this slide, but then on this slide, which are successful in a way if you look at it just by number of page views. But part of the problem with that is that the number of page views gets artificially inflated by those things where I have to click 10 times to just get through this list, which would take me only maybe 20 seconds to read otherwise.
So what you've shown here is the classical short-sightedness of the very nature of the CPM model, which is it can be totally and utterly gamed, and therefore as an advertiser, you're not getting an awful lot back for it.
Exactly, because actually, David could speak to this better than I could.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically the idea that there really isn't any scarcity in page views or CPMs, right? It's what our CEO always likes to say is that any day of the week, Mark Zuckerberg can add a box in the middle of Facebook and suddenly create 10,000 impressions with like the wave of his hand. And so when we are trying to think about how we can bridge this idea of valuing good content with time, we are kind of trying to bring in a new model, which is thinking about how much exposure in terms of time an ad will actually get. So rather than saying, rather than allowing people to kind of juice CPMs with kind of clickbaity articles and stuff like that, bringing time into the mix and saying, cool, well, how much time did this ad actually spend being exposed to an engaged audience on the site?
Yeah, which connects to so really quickly. When we looked at 2 billion visits across the web in the course of a month, we found 55% of those page views spent fewer than 15 seconds actually reading on the page, which, you know, if you're paying for ads and you're really paying for brand exposure, is getting you nothing in return on most of that. And what's interesting, both from the advertising standpoint as well as the editorial standpoint, and here at Chartbeat I work mostly on our editorial product, whereas David works mostly on our advertising products. One thing that kind of aligns it, and also as you kind of mentioned before, I think with you know, the democratization of news and content, something that is really interesting for us on all sides is that when we look at a website and we look at what is the most likely thing to bring someone back to that website, it is time. Like, the best predictor that we have that someone will come back to this website later in the week is how long they actually spent reading during their visit to that site. And so you can see through this graph here, when someone is spending, as someone spends more time reading on the site, their likelihood of coming back goes up with that. So
the classic argument of good quality content. I mean, that's all it is, isn't it? If you're producing good content, people want to read it, then they're going to be more likely to come back and see you.
Exactly, yeah. And you know, for us, the real key to this is being able to, you know, like, that just makes sense on the editorial side. The key is, you know, we need to make sure that we bridge that in terms of how people are monetizing their content as well. Now, it kind of, you know, it also, like, you see it happening in the industry. You know, you have the, you know, the IAB or the MRC kind of lifting, or I think it was the IAB lifting their, you know, advisory for viewable impressions, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that the industry is starting to get the sense, you know, starting to understand that, you know, an impression that isn't seen has, you know, has zero value, right? And so people are kind of starting to move this way, and that's, you know, we think that's certainly the right direction, and we hope that people will start to go further in saying, you know, it's not just about whether it's seen or not, but, you know, if you're a branded advertiser and you're trying to get exposure in front of an audience, then, you know, the more time that you're seen for, then the more valuable that impression is. And so, you know, what we're starting to do is basically, you know, break out impressions for any given site and say, hey, you know, you had this many impressions that were, you know, that were not seen at all. You have this many impressions that were 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and so on. And we start to kind of develop this idea of, you know, a premium impression based on the amount of time that it's being exposed. And we see that, like, this is actually not a particularly, like, it kind of makes sense, right? It's like, you know, the more time that your ad is seen for, then the more likely people are going to recall it, you know, which is kind of what everyone's looking for. And we're, you know, we've done some studies internally that kind of show that, you know, that basically say, you know, the more time that someone's exposed to a display ad, the more likely they are to recall what was, you know, what was put in front of them. But we've got other, you know, other folks have done it as well. I'm going to pull up another.
Just picking up on that though, David, because I absolutely fundamentally agree with you that it is common sense. I mean, it's absolutely common sense. But then psychologists have made their living on speaking pretty much common sense with common sense articles and common sense theories, which you read it and you go, well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's obvious though, right? It's totally and utterly obvious. But unless you're told that, unless you've got quantifiable analysis to back it up, people, especially in our industry here, are so swept up in the CPM model, the CPL model, they're not looking outside of that because that is just the way it is done. It's just that's it. There's not an alternative. And if you're starting to say, well, hang on a second, you know, let's look at something else here.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're totally right. And the truth is that we never really had data in the past to be able to prove that existing, you know, status quo was wrong, right? And you have, you know, there's this great story of, you know, so, like, why do we have all these, like, top banners everywhere, right? And why are those so valuable? It's because they're the things that we know are being viewed, right? And so, you know, you see this for a site's inventory, you see this devaluation in display ads that are below the fold, right, or down the page, because, you know, as an advertiser, you're not sure whether it's going to be seen or not. And there's a great story of there's a publisher who had this great idea saying, hey, why don't we take an ad and put it right in the middle of the content and charge a premium for it, because that's where people are spending their time, that's where they're reading. And so our audience is going to be exposed to that ad for longer. And they put it out in the marketplace and immediately got shut down because they didn't have the data to back that up. Right? What Chartbeat's doing is basically trying to say that, hey, that's actually the right idea, and we do have the data. I'll pull up a study that we borrow from Yahoo occasionally.
Yeah, and just one point to mention as we jump into that is that one thing I don't think we made explicitly clear is that we pay attention to how long someone is reading on the page. We also know how long they're spending reading with, for example, ads in view. So we actually know for this ad unit how long are people actually spending reading when they can see it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm pleased you said that, because it's one of the things I was thinking about. Well, hang on a second, because ad placement, obviously, you mentioned the below the fold thing. People are going to go, well, hang on a minute. A page is a big place. How do I know that they're actually seeing my ad, which is beneath what they're looking at? So yeah, okay, brilliant. That answered that question.
Cool. Thanks, Doug, for covering the bases. Yeah, let's see if we can pull this up. So so here's a study that was done by Yahoo Research, which was basically looking at exactly what we're talking about. So reported recognition of ads, of the advertiser in an ad versus the amount of time that ad was being exposed to that audience. And this is pretty clear, the classic up and to the right graph, which shows that basically the more time that someone is exposed to an ad, then the more likely they are to be able to recall the brand that was in that ad. It's not just Yahoo who's looked at it. Google has also looked at it as well, looking at it based on CTR in this case. And again, saying that the amount of time that ad spends in view, we see an increase in click-through rate for those ads as well. So yeah, and and again, to tie it all back together, the idea is that if we can, so we're measuring how much exposure time in seconds each ad on the page is getting, and then kind of tying that back into that advertiser's campaign, or we can give the publisher kind of site-wide stats that help them understand basically how they can value their inventory based on exposure time. And you kind of get something that looks a little bit like this, where it's not not all impressions are created equal. That's kind of the main thing here, and we can take a look at all the impressions that happen on the site and split those out in terms of how many seconds were each of those impressions being exposed to an audience. And what we're starting to see, and what the FT has started doing in the very recently, which is this great Ad Age article about it, is that they're trying this model out. They're kind of throwing this into the market and saying, okay, well, let's see if this is the sort of thing that advertisers are interested in, and they're being they're getting a lot of success, and people are saying, hey, actually, yeah, this is what we want, right? We all agree that CPM kind of sucks, and what we're looking for is time with your audience, and if you can actually give us time in a quantifiable way, then we're willing to test it out with you and see and try buying on time, which is kind of the really exciting stuff for the industry, and hopefully something that we'll see more of in the near future.
Yeah. So just taking that back a second before I expand on this Financial Times thing. You mentioned the FT there, because obviously the Financial Times is obviously British paper. What that graph you've just got up there at the moment, which I'm just blue boxing, white boxing, whatever you call it, so people can see it from home. Can you just explain this here for a second? Because one of the points in that slide 12 you had as well, which was of particular interest to me, which is the graph before that.
Yeah.
One of the first graphs that we saw was that only 55% of people will view a post for more than 15 seconds. Was that right? Am I right on those stats?
Yes.
So in here, we've got the click-through rate relative to all ads in viewable time. So is that the viewable time of the advert?
That's right, yeah. So you're totally right, and that's great to point out. So here we're talking about the time that the actual ad, the div of the ad is in view, versus the other study, we're actually just kind of looking at the page itself, like the article.
There we go. So basically, if you're positioning your ad in a very content-rich area of that article, so rather than people scan reading it, what you're saying here is obviously if they are reading it for more than 20 seconds, you're looking at 225% relative increase in click-through rate than 0. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and that's based off this Google study. Yeah.
Okay. And so this next graph that you had in here, and this is where you mentioned in the FT. So could you just explain this so that we get a picture of exactly what it is that you're suggesting from here?
Yeah, sure. So and this is less of so actually I should be a little clear about what it is exactly that we're looking at here, because this is not a kind of broad data study like some of the other things that we've shown. This is basically a sample for what one advertiser's campaign might look like if you were to break it out by exposure time per impressions, right? So this isn't saying like this is what the internet looks like when you look at all the impressions on the internet, but rather what one advertiser's kind of model for a campaign might look like if you were to break it out by the quality of the impressions, right? Which is basically just to illustrate again this idea that not all impressions are created equally, and that you have certainly a large number of impressions that aren't even viewed, but beyond that kind of viewed non-viewed binary, you also have a pretty large spectrum in terms of the amount of time that all of those impressions are being exposed for.
Yeah, so what we have in this graph is on the x-axis here, this is breaking down all of the 12.7 million impressions in this campaign into these buckets of this is how many of those impressions were seen for only 1 second. This is how many were seen for 5 seconds. This is how many were seen for 20 or more seconds over here, and everything in between.
So am I right in saying, so expose impressions by active exposure time. So the 5-second category is, hang on, so people who are seeing an advert for 5 seconds, it's more impressions than people who are seeing one for 6 seconds. Is that right? I'm just trying to understand this graph better.
Yeah, that's true, and that's what. Yeah, so this one is basically saying, for this campaign, and again, this is just a sample kind of dummy campaign. It's not. This data isn't necessarily real.
No. Okay.
That this is kind of illustrating that you've got more impressions that are happening in that 5-second exposure bucket than you do 6. Though it's important to point out that one of the kind of deceptive things about this particular graph is that there's a very long tail, in the sense that when you go from 6 all the way to 20+ seconds, that's actually a fairly large amount of that campaign's impressions that are getting exposure times of 6 seconds or above.
Yeah, the classic long tail side of all this. Well, I'll tell you what, look, we've got about 10 minutes left of this, and for those of you just watching, we're talking to Chartbeat here about how they're using live data analytics, and so especially in the publishing industry, about using it to the sort of the benefit. What I want to try and understand here is, okay, so I am the Financial Times. How am I going to use the sorts of data that you're showing now for ourselves internally, and at the same time externally to entice advertisers in? There's sort of 2 subsections of that question. So how can I use Chartbeat as a publisher to help me in those 2 areas?
Sure. Yeah. So what the FT has kind of started doing, what we've been working with them with, is to kind of start at getting a baseline of understanding your inventory based on exposure time, right? And that's just kind of one of these things that's about getting familiar with how we're measuring, right? And everyone's inventory is going to be a little different, right? So first you kind of have to get a sense for, okay, when I'm looking at my site, where do I get the most exposure time for my ads? Is it in the opinion section? Is it happening on the home page? Or breaking it down even further to specific ad positions, right? Am I getting the most amount of exposure time on my MPU or my leaderboard or whatever it might be? So again, first you want to get a kind of sense of breakdown for the inventory, so you can start to understand if I'm valuing my inventory based on exposure time, where am I seeing the most value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Then from there, you basically kind of start, introducing this metric to existing campaigns. Bye, Doug.
Sorry.
Oh, we're running out of batteries.
I thought that was graceful, and it really wasn't.
But yeah, right, so kind of introducing this idea of exposure to existing advertisers, seeing, how they're reacting to it, and, so far with the case of the FT, they've had really positive feedback coming back from advertisers, saying, hey, that this is a metric that we really like, that we're interested in seeing more of. Now, what they've kind of just announced recently is that they're going to kind of start a trial period of actually selling campaigns wherein the currency is time. So they're talking about CPH, or cost per hour, instead of a CPM model. And that because we can quantify just the total number of seconds that a campaign or a particular creative is being exposed to the audience, that the idea is, can we make time a currency, right? Unlike impressions, again, time can't really be gamed. You can't add a 25th hour to someone's day. So it's a really kind of appealing thing in the sense of that, if we can charge based on the total amount of time that someone's being exposed to this ad, what does that do to, can we charge a premium for that or whatever it might be? And so far, based on what we've heard, they're getting a lot of good feedback from advertisers on this kind of test that they're running on this new model.
Too right. I can see instantly that it's going to be something that people will understand, which is saying, well, don't just look at cost per lead, don't just look at cost per 1,000, look at cost per hour. And I wondered whether you had a defined CP something for how you're pushing it in with people. CPH, I like it.
It kind of makes sense also just in terms of, both just intuitively, but also when you think about models that advertisers are used to, for example, with television ads. Right. It's like, I'm paying for this block of time for this size of an ad.
I get it, absolutely. God, that is, well done. Wow, I knew I liked the system the moment I saw it and I understood some of the stuff that you were working on, and I absolutely get it. And I tell you what, look, to sort of almost close this down, what sort of companies will be working with Chartbeat, and how can people find out a little bit more about what you're doing?
Sure. So, typically we work with online publishers, but we're basically interested in talking to anyone who's this idea of the attention economy of kind of valuing content and advertising based on time. If that's a thing that you want to talk about, you should definitely hit us up. So a lot of the data studies that we showed, we actually tend to write about them quite a bit as well, and we keep a pretty active blog, which is just blog.chartbeat.com. Yeah, blog.chartbeat.com. And otherwise, you can always reach out to us individually.
Just Doug@chartbeat.com or David@chartbeat.com.
That's Doug. This is David.
Here.
Doug's got my beard envy. I tell you what, in November, I'm determined. It's Movember, and it's always my time where I sort of sneakily sneak in a beard at the same time. So,
I almost feel like I should go clean-shaven for the month of November, just to have something different.
Oh, I almost get divorced every single time I grow a beard, so I always get in severe trouble for that. But look, what I'm going to do, that blog.chartbeat.com, I'm just loading that into the showcase. So for those of you who are watching this, do click on the Be Part of the Conversation button at the bottom. And everything that these guys have just mentioned here about whether you can find them is now in, and I'm just copying and pasting that in. So that will now be live. There you go. It's just clicking in now. So online publishers, just a quick question on that. There's two quick things before we go. Number one, can it work the other way around? So if, let's say, you've got a big brand coming to you and saying, look, guys, I advertise on an awful lot of sites. Can you tell me how often my ads are being viewed? Can you flip it around to view it from the advertising side rather than the publisher's side?
Yeah, so right now we're mostly focusing on the publishing end. Certainly I think there is a future wherein, if we're getting buy-in from agencies or brands, that that this is kind of potentially coming from that side as well. But because Chartbeat has been, we're kind of a classic publishers company. We've always built tools and created things to help publishers out. We're starting from that perspective and going from there.
Yeah. And one last thing, we haven't mentioned this at all, and I'm gutted. But you brought up that classical little thing, the attention economy, which sounds like something you'll find in Wired magazine. But you've hit the nail on the head, which is we're looking at the cost per hour stuff here. And people, we are paying for people's attention. So it is a classic attention economy. And in essence, I suppose that's what you guys are doing, which is you are building this ability for marketeers to have a look and pay on this attention economy. So brilliant stuff.
Yeah. And then the nice thing about that also is, in this model that we're really we're heavy advocates for, in that publishers are putting out quality content win, advertisers win, and if everyone's focusing on quality, hopefully so does the audience, so do the visitors to the sites because they're getting better experiences.
Yeah, too right. And it's a classic thing. Again, I come back to that original quote: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if blog site owners, if publishers aren't realizing that some of their content is just simply not good enough, and if advertisers are getting wise to the fact that, look, you might get loads of, lots of CPM out of here, so you're taking a load of my money, but if these people are simply looking and clicking off, or you're gaming on the CPM because it's just lots of slideshow images, it's a short-sighted viewpoint of where the very future of marketing online is going. Christ. Yeah, I can see the next sort of 2 to 5 years of marketeers going, I don't want to spend a CPM model anymore.
This is what we want. Forward-thinking marketeers, yes.
They're the ones you want. I get it. All right, guys, look, I just want to say thank you ever so much for your time. Catherine Hislop, I just see you put here, missed you. You should have invited in advance. I'm sorry. I've done the best I can on this one. I do apologize. But look, guys, thank you for your time at chartbeat.com. All the stuff is in the Showcase app that you guys can click on. There's a couple of articles there. There's their blog, and there is their main website as well. It only leaves me to say, do join me next week. We've got the midweek marketing mix, and we've got a massive star cast. We've got Ryan Hanley. We have got Dustin Stout. We have got, who's the third person? I always forget the third person. Joshua Berg talking about the SEO stuff. So that is our snapshot of everything's going on with the social media world. 10-minute slots talking about what's cool, what's going on, what's happening. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with the What Does the Data Tell You show. And we've got some cool stuff happening. We've just got to confirm the guests coming in, but there's some pretty good stuff. So I hope that's given you a good insight. Doug, David, thank you ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it, guys. And I look forward to the next time we have you on. So thanks ever so much. And cheers, everybody. See you next time.